Welcome to Westmont's Compelling Conversations. I'm Gayle D. Beebe, president of Westmont College. In Compelling Conversations, I engage scholars, leaders, authors, and members of our community in discussions that inform us about essential issues and encourage us to take meaningful action. I'm here today with Dr. Malcolm Guite, former chaplain and life fellow of Girton College, Cambridge University. I first became aware of Malcolm as a result of my love of George Herbert. And Malcolm had written a poem that had been turned into a song called Descent, performed by Steve Bell. And I didn't even know that they had become collaborators. But here was a man who embodied a love for George Herbert that I had never experienced. I was first introduced to George Herbert during seminary. My thesis advisor, Dr. Diogenes Allen, had introduced me during my thesis work to Herbert. And we began to talk, Dr. Allen and I did, about as much as we loved truth, as much as we loved goodness, that there were times in the life of the church and even in our own life where the only thing that drew us was beauty. And here was somebody who had just plumbed the depths of George Herbert and brought to light the beauty of his poetry that leads us back to God and ultimately back to the eternal city. Malcolm, welcome. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you. It's very good to be at Westmont again. It's a good place to visit.
Well, we are already well underway and just enjoying so much you being here, the way you inhabit space. You have told us some about just how you developed a love for poetry. Would you mind going through some of that?
Yes, very happily. I mean, I look back now and I just realized what great good fortune and blessing it was for me to have the parents I had, particularly my mother, and actually coming down through her, my grandmother. So my mother's Scottish, I'm half Scots. And my mother was a wonderful storyteller, but she also had this great fund of poetry. And she would just move from chatting to you to suddenly you could feel the lift and the lilt and the cadence and the beauty of the language. And she would be quoting a poem. And she wasn't going like, now, sit down, Malcolm, this is poetry, it's good for you, you've got to have 10 minutes of it before you go out to play. It was just part of her, it was her way of enhancing your life and the way you saw things. So I think I was telling you, we used to travel back from Africa by sea each year, and I loved it when the great ship got going and we were leaving the port. It was very exciting, and the kind of wake of the ship, the furrow, and I'd be looking back with my mum as we left, and she'd say, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. And I didn't know that was the ancient mariner. I say, that's lovely. And she says, oh, well, there's more, and maybe when it was really hot and we were crossing the equator, she would quote lines about day after day, we stuck no breath, no motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. So eventually I realized that was Coleridge. And eventually, my mother, actually, I asked for more, so she recited, she had the whole poem by heart. But she would do that again and again, just at places, or she'd sometimes, when anything that she wanted to say had already been said beautifully by a poet, she would avail herself of that language right up, towards the end. I mean, she had this wonderful thing when she was getting arthritis. She had a walker, and I remember walking with her once. She was saying, body's getting a bit creaky, and she would suddenly say, the soul's dark cottage, battered and decayed, lets in new light through chinks that time hath made. Stronger by weakness, wiser men become as they draw near to their eternal home. Leaving the old, both worlds at once they view, who stand upon the threshold of the new. I'd say, Mum, what was that? And she said, oh, it's a little poem called Old Age by Edmund Waller. And I would go and find it in the Oxford Book of English Verse. And it's the last thing Edmund Waller wrote. And Katie's like, you're an old person, you're writing your final poem. And the last word, or the last phrase of a poem called Old Age is the threshold of the new. So it wasn't just beauty of language, it was also a kind of hope. And yet it was, you know, the soul's dark cottage, that's our body, battered and decayed. The poetry she quoted was never sentimental. It wasn't like a nice greetings card rhymed, you know. So she could sometimes quote things that were, you know, really putting their finger on darkness and doubt and suffering. And yet somehow the beauty whispered of hope even in the, and so I thought that was a regular thing. Like we were moving all the way around Africa, you know, Nigeria and Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was then, traveling. So I wasn't always at school, and I wasn't always like just at regular school. I didn't really start being at a regular school till I was maybe like 6 or 7. So I'd had all this, and my father's. So I remember making my first new friend, and we were talking about home to each other. I said, you know that thing when your mum recites the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner? He's going, what? I said, you know, like, how long does your mum do it for? Like, my mum can do the whole thing. It's amazing, you know. And she's just like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I had no idea, because that was my own experience. I thought all people's mothers, you know, recite, you know, when the sun was setting, put their arm around you and said, out beyond the sunset, could I but find the way, is a sleepy blue laguna that widens to a bay. There's the blessed city, so the sailors say, the golden city of St. Mary. So I think one of the things that had on me is that I heard sound and rhythm and beauty and rhyme. And I heard it from the person who loved and nurtured me. And I saw her to some degree transfigured by the actual recitation. So naturally, I did the same. You know, I learnt those, and I found I had the same thing with my mother, that if I recited a poem 2 or 3 times, you know, because I liked it, because I enjoyed the sound of it, just like a kid would sing along to a soundtrack if we'd had, but we didn't have any electronic stuff. We didn't, you know, my parents had a record player, but they didn't let us, you know, play with it. We didn't have a TV. We had the radio. So, I mean, later on when I got a record player, and I bought records by Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, and these were the poets, I found I'd played the record a couple of times, I knew all the lyrics. But I already knew more poetry than I knew I knew. Because sometimes, and this is still the case now, literally, I mean, for example, just now when I was telling you about the Edmund Waller poem, Old Age, I didn't know until I started whether I could get to the end of that or not. I just started drawing it out.
Right.
So later when I came to feel that I was being called to be a poet, I mean, poetry is not, we talk about George Herbert, so yeah. George Herbert's a huge influence on me. And when I write sonnets or I write that poem Descent, which is in specifically a meter that George Herbert used, people say, aren't you afraid of the blank piece of paper? You know, what do I do with my blank piece of paper? There's no blank piece of paper. You know, I'm using a language I didn't make up. I've inherited English. That's a joy. I've inherited a heritage of poetry. If I write a sonnet, I know Shakespeare wrote sonnets, and I know those sonnets, and I know George Herbert wrote sonnets. I know those sonnets. John Donne, I know. I'm aware of the different things that can be done. I'm in, as it were, a kind of long conversation. Actually, conversations, I'll tell you a better image. The great Scottish writer, George MacDonald, the bicentenary of whose birth was last year, the man who had such a huge influence on Lewis and Tolkien. So he's known as a great fantasy writer and as a great preacher, the unspoken sermons. But he's also one of the earliest literary critics of the 19th century. He wrote a book called England's Antiphon. And it's about the long tradition of English poetry. And he has a really interesting idea. He says, forget the chronological order. I mean, you can learn about it. Because all these poets are alive in your head. And then he said, I want you to imagine, he called it an auricular chapel, a chapel of the ear, the sound of the... And I want you to see the poets as like choristers on either side of the chapel, singing antiphonally to one another. So it's like, I hear George Herbert sing something, and then I think, that's the call, I want a response. The thing that, I mean, Herbert really, I mean, obviously it's helpful model because he's an Anglican priest and poet, and so am I. and we have a very similar vision of sacraments. But I'll tell you what I think makes Herbert's poems truly great, not just beautiful, but true, is the way Herbert unflinchingly includes the sorrows and the elegies and the losses and the pains of this world. You know, so one of my favorite Herbert poems is like really, really short. It's just called Bitter Sweet. And it goes something like, "Ah, my dear angry Lord." I love him, and yet I feel, "Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost strike, yet help afford, sure I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve, and all my sour sweet days I will lament and love." You know, so much of the world, the contentious world I was brought up in, was like, either you think that everything is terrible and you're an angry, bitter young man, or you're some kind of gooey, soft, you know, sentimental Christian with a pasted smile on your face, and like, you know, which is, and obviously if you're a teenager, grim realism, you know, and kind of existential angst look far more attractive than, you know. But then you come across poets like John Donne and George Herbert, who've been exactly where you are in facing death and doubt and despair and all of those things. But they have a strong Christian faith, and they bring the two together, and you suddenly understand what the cross is about. But lament and love, I mean, as you know, the final poem in Herbert's The Temple, and perhaps the greatest poem he wrote, I would say one of the top 10 poems in the English language at all, is Herbert's poem Love.
Love 3.
Love 3. So love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack, from my first entrance in, drew nearer. That's wonderful. But I believe that poem. I believe in the love that I encounter in that poem, because he's also said, I lament, because he expresses the pain as well as the joy. It gives an authenticity. And in fact, that very poem, he deals with all the issues. My soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. And the other thing about Herbert is the wit.
Do you think, I mean, my version of The Temple is anchored to the country parson.
Yeah.
Do you think that both your vocation as a poet and your vocation as an Anglican priest helps you understand?
Yeah, no, I think that it took me a while to learn that, in spite of Herbert's example. For a start, I started wanting to be a poet as an angst-ridden 16-year-old, right? By which time I'd lost my faith. Oh, okay. So I had a poetic vocation, and poetry was the only thing that was keeping my spiritual life alive. Yeah. And it was for me, it was a pre-runner. Eventually, I got to that point where the poetry had baptized or rebaptized my imagination, and my mind could follow. And I became a Christian again in the course of studying English literature at Cambridge. So, I mean, you could sum up C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy by saying, you know, my imagination was baptized first, you know, reading George MacDonald. The rest of me took a little bit longer to catch up. That was my story. So yeah, I came back to faith. So the poetry was first. Then, after I came back to faith and I was confirmed and I was a school teacher, I was also working on a PhD on John Donne, the older friend of Herbert, and Lancelot Andrews, one of the makers of the authorized version, the King James, and how the two of them influenced T.S. Eliot. And obviously, Andrews and Donne were both Anglican priests. I was rereading Herbert alongside them, and I began to wonder whether I had a vocation to priesthood. So eventually I discerned that I did, and I came back. And I wrote a little bit of poetry about that time, but then after I was ordained, I plunged into parish life. And for the first 7 years of my ordained life as a priest, I didn't write any poetry at all. And that wasn't like Jared Manley Hopkins being told by his superiors not to do it. So I look back at that and say, why? And I realized that the poet in me was completely absorbed into the priest in me, and particularly with the liturgy, right? If you think about the liturgy, it's like a beautiful shaped vessel of words which draws you in, speaks truth to you beautifully, moves you on, and delivers you back to the world changed and renewed and full of purpose. Now, that's exactly what I would want any poem to do.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the liturgy is one of the great poems, you know. And I would, by celebrating the liturgy, in a sense, the poetic bit of me was satisfied in liturgy and preaching. That's one reason. The other thing was literally there was so much to do. And now, but here's the thing. After about 7 years toil in the vineyard, I started actually to get what I now realize was burnout. I was just overdoing everything. I needed some deep refreshment. And the bishop said to me, like, you need a sabbatical. Take a little time off, do what you like. You can write me a report about it, but I'm more concerned that you just rest. So I suddenly thought, I need poetry. I really, really need poetry. So I just immersed myself, not just Christian, I just reread the corpus of the corpus of English poetry, and realized I knew half of it, but it all came back, and it was like wells rising, spring. I thought, oh, thank goodness, I needed that. And then I thought that I looked around at the church, I saw other priests burning out, I saw, all kinds of issues. And I decided to offer a course, like an adult education course, but not just for Christians. I did it in the mainstream further education colleges, called Faith, Hope and Poetry. And I found the mix, that there were about half of them were secular people that loved poetry, didn't have any time for Christianity, but I guess they'd always felt there was a spiritual element to poetry. They were intrigued that a priest wanted to read poetry with them. The other half of the people that came to the course were burned out Christians like me, whose imaginations had been starved, who'd been stuck in this kind of task-oriented, work-oriented, kind of rather law-driven legalism, And the poetry was like, and these people met on the course and were going, so eventually a book came out of that called Faith, Hope and Poetry. So after that, suddenly poetry was more central. And in the course of that course, I made the case for the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty. I made the case that unless our imagination is fully engaged, we're not loving the Lord with all our heart and all our soul and all our strength and all our mind. We need imagination as reason. And then I suddenly thought, well, wait a minute, Malcolm. Didn't you used to do this? Wasn't this the heart of what you thought you were called to do when you were a student? Maybe now is the time. Wow. So as we were coming up to the millennium, I did a retreat, the aim of which was to find in one sentence, only one sentence, what do you think you're here to do distinctly? And you did it by Bible studies, by looking at your favorite gospel passages, by looking at the saints and the great Christians before you, whom you admire, and you gradually. So I finally came up with my one sentence. And when I wrote it, this was right around 2000, so the beginning of the millennium. It's like, I've got to reorient myself for this second half of my life. When I wrote it, it was blindingly obvious, but I had no idea. Like, you need sometimes to do it. So my sentence was to use my love of language and my facility for it to kindle my own and other people's imaginations for Christ. It's about language and then I did this sort of inventory of what I actually do with my time. And I realized I was chair of 16 different committees. Like, I should not be the chair of even one committee. I have no leadership talent whatsoever, but it kind of went with the territory of being a vicar. Yeah. So I started resigning from committees. And I gradually, so every time anybody asks me to do anything, I ask myself, how far does this enable me to use language to kindle the imagination for Christ? That's why I'm here.
Purpose statement.
You guys, that is my purpose statement. Yeah. And suddenly I realized I've always been doing that as a priest, the way I preach, the way I'm engaging with it. And I've done it through teaching poetry. But suddenly I realized spending serious committed time to writing poetry is not time off. It is the vocation. And that was so important because
Well, my entree into the conversation about imagination actually was reading some Coleridge. Did he also?
Coleridge is key to all of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I eventually wrote up the book, I'd started it as a kind of open access adult education course, but I saw that there was an academic book to be written. Okay. So I did a series, full academic monograph called Faith, Hope and Poetry, Theology and the Poetic Imagination. And I realized there was a central chapter on Coleridge in that, and I realized that I had quoted Coleridge in every single chapter of that book.
Oh my goodness.
So later I thought, okay, I have to have a deep dive into Coleridge, and eventually I wrote a book called Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But at the core of Coleridge's defense of the imagination as truth-bearing is a really deep thinking or rethinking of what it is to speak of the imago Dei, of the image of God in us. So, Coleridge recognized that reason and analytic reason is extremely important and is capable of rendering genuine knowledge about the phenomena.
Yeah.
But it's information and knowledge, it's not wisdom. It's not meaning. So, as you know, in the Enlightenment, because of the beautiful perfection of Newton's calculations about the motion of heavenly bodies and the interaction, the conservation, the momentum, the mass times the velocity of one object is the other, people could think of the operations of the world in parallel with the invention they'd made of a piece of clockwork as a series of inevitable interactions. And the dominant image of the cosmos was of a machine. Now, that's quite helpful in terms of looking at some phenomena, but it's completely pointless in other ways. It's what Coleridge called this watchmaking scheme of things. An image or a model is fine as long as you know it's just a model. As soon as you think it's really the case, it becomes an idol. And I think we had this awful, as it were, idolatry to reason and mechanism. So Coleridge propounded a completely different. He said, okay, if you assume that our way of knowing is always passive, that there's no loving shaping of meaning going on in here, you can have a mechanistic model and you can have a mechanistic. But supposing it's not, supposing we're made in the image of God and that image is active and creative. And then he said, let me just suggest a different model. Instead of thinking of the cosmos as a piece of clockwork made eons ago by a watchmaker who's now retired to some distance, it's deism, he says, supposing it's more like a poem, supposing it's more like an utterance. A poem is a physical thing, an utterance is a measurable sound, but invisibly in that is meaning. So he says, look, if I gave you a poem printed out, right, and you're particularly interested in the history of paper, you could do a superb chemical analysis of the paper to the degree that you could probably work out what the original trees were that made the paper. Then you could do analysis of the ink. You could do a geometrical study of the shapes of the letter and a statistical study of their recurrence. You could work for 2 or 3 years and accumulate a huge amount of interesting and verifiable factual knowledge. And you would never know it was a poem. And then supposing...
That's a great illustration.
Then I suppose I come and read it to you. Yeah. You go, oh my goodness, it means something. Yeah. Now, that does not alter or challenge any of the statistical and chemical knowledge. Right. In fact, some of the stuff you found out, like about the frequency of the letters, might even be helpful in understanding the poem, but you've got to know it's a poem. So, Coleridge eventually put that philosophically, but he got there as a poet earlier. In Frost at Midnight, one of my favorite. He's got his little kid who's lying there and he's thinking, how do I educate my child? How is my child going to grow up? That's still a major question that, it's the first mature question a man asks himself is, how do I bring up my child? So he says, I was in the great city pent and saw naught lovely, but then he says this, thou, my child, shall wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores beneath the crags of ancient mountains that mirror in their bulk. And then he suddenly says, so shalt thou see and hear. And he doesn't say, so shalt thou see and hear certain geological phenomena, certain rock strata, certain measurable things. That is what you'll see and hear. But he says, so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who doth teach himself in all, and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. So these shapes and sounds, everything here, it's intelligible. That is to say, it means something.
You are listening to Westmont's Compelling Conversations with President Gayle D. Beebe.
Now, Malcolm, as you think about Coleridge and imagination, he also had a clear understanding of how fantasy could actually take you away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's really important because, so in the 13th chapter of his Biographia Literaria, he makes this famous definition and then distinction between imagination, what he calls fancy. So the first thing he says, he talks about us all having a primary imagination and a secondary imagination, but then also this capacity for wish fulfillment fantasies. Yeah. So he says, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception and a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now that blows my mind. When we were taught that at university, they didn't give us the second half of that sentence. Okay. They went, power and prime agent of all human perception. They didn't go on about the repetition in the finite mind of the eternal. So he's not talking just about poets and people. Right. He's talking about all of us. When he says it's the prime agent, the living power and prime agent of human perception, and it's a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act. Think about it like this. Again, going back to the paper. There's huge streams of data flowing into us through our five senses. Why should one bit of it be more important than another bit of it? Why should the data that forms a human face and distinguishes the human face from the nice piece of wood or the hat stand behind, why should I care about that more than the hat stand? Why should I see the fullness of a tree rather than just a bunch of little things? So Coleridge believed that there is a shaping power in perception. And he's riffing on Kant. So Kant has this really rather bleak analysis between what Kant calls the phenomenal and the nominal. So you know this thing. So Kant is the person to observe that what we see, the things we take to be real and solid, the surfaces of things, are shaped by the shape of our mind. Yeah. There's some kind of other reality behind that, which he calls the nuance, which we can't know. Now that had a terrible effect on people because they're going like, I can't trust anything. Am I just, there's a gap between the subjective and the objective. Yeah. So Coleridge said, okay, Emmanuel, but speaking of the word Emmanuel, God is, let me go to the beginning of John's Gospel. Let me see that how all things are made in and through the Logos, the Word. And then that Logos is the light that lightens every man that comes into the world. And Genesis tells me that we're made in the image of God. Maybe it's not as disastrous as Kant thinks it is. Maybe God fills the world with meaning as he speaks it. But obviously, because it's a physical world, it's got to be made up of stuff, just like the pen and the ink and the paper are stuff. We could just process the stuff. But if we're to see that the stuff means something, that it's shape and it's something, then we need this powerful imagination. How can we trust it? This primary imagination is a repetition in our mind of the imagination of the poet, of God, making things. So what happens is his mind the mind of God brings forth this beauty. And our mind and imagination takes the physical stuff of the cosmos and interprets it in light of the way God, and just like the poem shimmers into being between us, if I read it to you. So the cosmos shimmers into being when our mind meets his. That's the primary imagination. And then he says, if God does that, we can do it too. We can take words or paint or anything. We can take just stuff and we can shape it meaningfully in such a way that another imagination gets the meaning. And that's what we're doing when Shakespeare writes. And those two kinds of imagination differ in degree, but not in kind. Right. And they're both to do with the Imago Dei. Now comes, he says, however, it's blindingly obvious that we can just make stuff up, which is not blessed with that primary genial wisdom that comes from God. And so he uses this word fancy, which we might think of as, and he says fancy has nothing but fixities and definites to play with. In fancy, we just reassemble stuff in the shape we'd like to have it. And he calls it mechanistic rather than organic. When you make a great work of art, it's great in the same way that a tree is great, that the roots and the branches relate to each other, that the smallest pattern on one leaf is related to the whole. He praises Shakespeare supremely as having this organic rather than mechanic thing. But we can also, and particularly we do this because we're fallen, we can just disassemble and reassemble in a way that pleases the ego.
That is such an amazing definition.
So the problem is we need to say, okay, let's critique false fantasy.
Yeah.
But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's also realize that we need the full shaping, organic, molding power, perceiving power of the imagination. If we're going to get what God is saying. So think about the beginning of Psalm 19, which, Coleridge loved, Lewis loved it. It's the poets love that opening line. I see you have it inscribed on your observatory. I was walking around. So the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and the firmament showeth forth his handiwork. Night unto night uttereth speech, although there is no speech. So we can learn a huge amount about the composition of stars, and it's really worth knowing. And we've advanced enormously in that respect. But in some cases, we've advanced and then forgotten the other half of truth. That you don't perceive a star fully, the wholeness of what a star is, unless you have both the reason telling you about its history and composition and the imagination responding to the meaning that God put into it, which is that the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Now, C.S. Lewis gets this. Just one of my favorite moments in The Magician's Nephew is when Eustace Scrubb, who's the guy that represents this dissecting, mechanistic, reductive, it's only just stuff, modernism, who's in this magical world. He meets a star, like having been a body in the heavenly bodies, this star is embodied as a person. And so, somebody says this guy's a star, and literally a star. So Eustace says, well, in our world, a star is just a huge ball of flaming gas exploding into the vacuity of cold space. And the guy says to him, even in your world, Eustace, that's not what a star is. It's only what it's made of.
Interesting.
That distinction to give to kids. So I would remember when we didn't have Richard Dawkins then, but we had B.F. Skinner. Everybody going you're just a bunch of chemicals. Right. You're just the unwinding of an enzyme. You're just the self-replication of a selfish gene. Nothing but, as it were. You're nothing but that. So anything you thought was to do with love or truth or beauty or meaning is just an epiphenomenon. You're reduced to the stuff you're made of. Well, and you are not. You're made of stuff, but you are more than what you're made of.
Who is actually teaching or articulating, advancing that kind of robust understanding of knowledge? One of the other authors that I read with Diogenes Allen was Austin Farr.
Oh yes,
and he has one of my most memorable essays was reading On Credulity, and where he's basically saying, if you're going to study something economically, you introduce artificial boundaries. If you're going to study something biologically, you introduce artificial boundaries, and you can study it, but don't forget that you introduce the boundaries.
Yeah.
And then he makes the case that there's 4 components of knowledge: natural science, social science, and then the question of ethics, and ultimately the question of ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And unless you take into account all 4 areas, you haven't actually considered the dimension of truth.
And in fact, Austin Farr is absolutely right there. But this goes a long way back. It goes back actually to before the Christian dispensation. Aristotle in his book it's talking about causality, says if anything exists, it has these 4 causes. It has a first cause, it has a formal cause, it has an efficient cause, and it has a final cause. So the first cause is the making of anything, the the existence of things. The formal cause, if we take, one of your nice Westmont cups, the formal cause of it is its cuppitude. Yeah. Like the shape and form of a cup is why it's a cup and not a guitar, right? The efficient cause is all the process of physically making that, the chemistry of the clay, that's the processes that lead to the cup. But its final cause is its end, is that it was made so that you could drink coffee, right? Now, of those four causes, first, formal, efficient, and final, what we call science is only talking about efficient causes. It's talking about how one thing becomes another and what the processes of nature are. It simply doesn't ask the question, how did anything come into being in the first place? What is it for? Yeah. And are there non-material forms or ideas, which, like, if you like, the cuppitude of the cup, Well, so I mean, I've got no quarrel with the science of efficient causes, but I have a strong quarrel with people saying there are only efficient causes. It's blindingly obvious that there has to be a beginning, that there has to be a purpose. And those are not, to ask the efficient cause and answer questions is a noble thing to do, providing you don't totalize it and say that's all there is. And to get the other stuff, you need imagination.
A question I wanted to come to from Herbert is, all of my questions go through Herbert. He talks about the importance or almost primacy of Scripture, and I was curious how, but then he also, in one of his poems, talks about what I would end up calling natural revelation or the way in which the created order bears general revelation of God. But Herbert seems to place it under Scripture, not equal to Scripture.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Obviously, all poets, to some degree, are natural theologians just because they see nature. But Herbert is very much under Scripture. And I think the way he would understand it is that whilst he can write a poem like, for example, Providence, where he talks about the beautiful interaction of all the physical things, and then talks about man as the world's high priest, and we utter the praise for all of it, which you could have done without a special revelation. Although high priest is clearly, I think his view is that if you think of ourselves as being inside the utterance of God, inside the poem of the cosmos, what if the poet appeared beside you inside the poem and walked around in it with you and said, look, see what I did there? That's what this means. And he sees the whole of Holy Scripture, but particularly within Holy Scripture, the life and ministry of Jesus, as giving us the key to understanding the larger thing. So you come to nature through the Scriptures, and specifically through Christ. So you first learn from Christ what death and resurrection means, and then you say, now Jesus has said to me, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies. So now I understand what sowing and reaping really mean. I know. So now I can go back out with that knowledge and see the world. So the place, I think, where Herbert really, there's two poems where he specifically says this. There's a poem called Vanity, which is about the emptiness of knowledge without. And then there's this amazing poem, The Agony, where he points about he's living in an age of discoveries. He says there's no point discovering any of these stuff unless we learn the central meaning of it all in Christ. So you remember, Vanity begins, philosophers have measured mountains, walked with a staff to heaven, foreseen the seas of states and made kings, And then he says, but there are two vast, spacious things, the which to know it doth much more behove, but few there be that sound them, sin and love. And then he says, if you want to know what those are, go to Christ. So who would know sin? Let him repair unto Mount Olivet. There shall he see a man so wrung with pains that all his skin, his Lord says, where his garments bloody be. Sin is that press and vice which forceth pain to hunt his cruel food through every vein, the image of the person. And then he says, who would know love, let him essay and taste again that juice which a pike did set a broach. So this is Christ on the cross, pierced in love. And then he concludes the whole poem, with two of the finest. Love is that liquor sweet and most divine, which my God feels as blood, but I as wine. Now, in the opening, he actually talks about height and depth. We've measured the mountains, we've gone down to the depths. Yeah. We're really good at exploring the outer structure of the world. But he doesn't say, now after that we can have a little quiet pietistic religion, on the side. He takes you the height and depth of mountains, the physical world, and then he says there are two vast and spacious things, the which to measure it doth more behove, but few there be that sound them, sin and love. He's saying the biggest primal realities are the realities of our relationship with God, characterized first by sin, well, originally by blessing, by sin, and then by the love that redeems sin. Once you know that, then you can go out and explore everything else, and you will have a key to understanding the meaning of everything else, because you'll find that reflected elsewhere. It's like if you tell a great story, or Shakespeare writes a great play, there's the central action, and then you find every little word elsewhere in the play tells you about the central action once you know it. Like if you read Hamlet and you realize the immense question of who is this figure? Is it the ghost of the king, or is it a demon? Who is Hamlet? Is he an obedient son to his old father or to his new father? Who? Now, the opening words of the whole play are, who goes there? You don't realize how significant that is until, do you know what I mean? Yeah. Once you get the center, then all the details come into view. Wow. And I think Herbert is saying our knowledge of the center comes through Scripture, but specifically through Scripture's witness to who Christ is.
To the living Christ.
Know that, then you can have tremendous intellectual adventures. Science is your friend after that, all of that. Yeah. So, it's a riffing on Augustine in the end. I mean, Augustine says, credo ut intelligam. I remember when I first read that, I believe in order to understand. It was such a revelation, because I was a very, very ardent, 19, 20-year-old who'd rejected faith, was trying to use my mind to the very best of my ability to understand everything. And I stupidly thought that if I finally understood everything, I might be able to believe Christianity. And I realized mentally I was never going to get there. I had to accept that if I was to know anything of God, God had to show me who he was. But that accepting Christianity, far from being intellectual suicide, as my friends thought, was actually the key to learning and wisdom.
Pascal was my transition into that, but of course he's so influenced by St. Augustine, and just amazing. I have got to ask for you to describe how you crafted Descent, because I absolutely love that poem.
Oh, right. Well,
and it's just magical.
Well, it started off as a shorter poem, and then Steve Bell started turning it into a song, and he said, no, we need more verses. He was right. So the meter, I love talking about the craft of poetry, so I might get a bit nerdy here.
No,
but,
I love this.
So the meter of the poem is called English Sapphics. So most English meters are modeled on Greek meters.
Okay.
It's English Sapphics is a 4-line stanza where you have what's called, it's an iambic, it's da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. It's a tetrameter, there's 4 of them, They sought to soar into the skies, those classic gods of high renown, for lofty pride aspires to rise. You're expecting the next line to be da-dum, 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 something. But the next line is, but you came down. Just 4 words. Yeah. You've gone from 4 metrical feet or 8 syllables to just 4. George Herbert's poem, I think it's the poem Virtue, uses that meter perfectly. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright. But he says, but thou must die. And It's about how all the beautiful things of this, Herbert's poem sets a series of beautiful things and says, but each of them must pass. And through those passing things, he turns to Christ. That's the poem. But I just thought that meter was perfect for a poem about the kenosis, about the self-emptying, about the great, eternal, infinite God coming down to be this crying child. This was part of a thing I did. I've been gradually going through. One of the most astonishing things about the temple, Herbert's collection, is the metrical variety. He hardly ever uses the same form twice. And he uses iambs mostly, but he has longer lines, shorter lines. I wrote a poem called After Prayer, which is based on his meter in the pulley. So that was the thing. So what was I then going to do? I mean, I was trying to make a contrast between the great gods of the classical antiquity, whose stories I heard from my father as professor of classics, but a strong Christian. And my father both understood what could be drawn from the classics into Christianity, but he also understood what was utterly set aside, what was radically new about the Christ event. And I must have heard my father, I used to listen to my father preach, so I probably heard my father draw a contrast between the Parthenon and the beautiful frieze on the Parthenon and the perfection of that. And the sense, the Greeks particularly thought it was almost shameful to have a body and shameful to be in time, that there was something essentially incomplete about human existence, and they yearned to a realm of eternal ideas, and that's what. And I can remember my father saying, that's a very attractive worldview, especially as you're getting older. The only problem is God, who is already in that perfect form, did the exact opposite and came down.
Well, that is such a powerful poem.
So then a poem, I'll see if I can recollect for you. You'll hear the meter now. So I guess I developed that contrast in different ways. They sought to soar into the skies, those classic gods of high renown. For lofty pride aspires to rise. But you came down. You dropped down from the mountain sheer, forsook the eagle for the dove. The other gods demanded fear, but you gave love. So you can hear this short line each time. Where chiseled marbles seem to freeze their abstract and perfected form, compression brought you to your knees. Your blood was warm. They called for blood in sacrifice, and victims on their altars bled, when no one else could pay the price. You died instead. They towered above our mortal plane, dismissed this restless flesh with scorn, aloof from birth and death and pain. But you were born to these burdens, borne by all, born with us all, astride the grave, weak to be with us when we fall, and strong to save.
That's just beautiful.
So everything turns on the little line at the end. It's the diminuendo. And one of the things that happens when you're writing poetry is sort of memories of other writers come in and ask to be alluded to. So before I became a Christian, I was kind of an angst-ridden existentialist. And I thought, life is completely meaningless. We're all on the brink of the void. The best thing to do is to own that and say, in spite of everything, I will seek a self-made authenticity because there's nothing. So one of the writers I most completely absorbed was Samuel Beckett. And Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, where you keep showing up but Godot doesn't. And what's the point? There's a character called Pozzo who puts the bleakest view of human life in that play, and he says, they give birth astride the grave. The light gleams for an instant, then all is darkness. Birth, and you're literally dropping from, right? So suddenly, that phrase, astride the grave, presented itself to me that I could say that in front of Christ, and it would have a whole, born to these burdens borne by all, born with us all, astride the grave. I'm quoting Samuel Beckett in a poem formed by George. Yes, he takes on all of that. Yes, you're right, Beckett. Compared with any stretch of time, we're only here for a minute. You know, he says the grave digger puts on the forceps. You know, it's so brief, this life. And yet, God eternal enters into that brevity for us. You know, and his life is even briefer than most people's. He's 33, is he, when he died, you know? So weak to be with us when we fall. But I really wanted to save the word save for the end of the poem. One thing I've learned from Herbert and Dunn is like the last line and the last word. Like, to what word do you give the last word in a poem?
Interesting.
You know, so I wanted that word save, weak to be with us when we fall, and strong to save. That, you know, this guy, so when I was this sort of atheist existentialist teenager, I was doing an O-level, you know, in religious studies at the age of 7. And I'm happy to say that, I mean, I was pretty good at exams, but the only O-level I ever failed was religious knowledge. And I can tell you why I failed it. So it was just awful. We were supposed to have studied Mark's Gospel, but which I did, you know. So the question was a little essay question. If Jesus was alive today, would he be a doctor, a lawyer, a revolutionary, you know, like choose one of these above and then give answers from reading of Mark's Gospel, which it would be. No, I was not a believer at the time, but I just dismantled. I said, if Jesus was alive today, I thought the entire point of Christianity, certainly the point of Mark's Gospel, when they get to the empty tomb, is that Jesus is alive today. And I assume that if he's alive today, he's being what he said he would be in the first place, which is a savior. You know, and then I quoted the Johannine thunderbolt, and Mark, you know, the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom. So I wrote this essay rebuking, and I can imagine the marker with his grid, everything I'm and like it's 0, 0, 0. But you know, save is such a great word. I'm certain of one thing. I'm certain that I need saving.
So you wrote an authentic answer, and it wasn't received.
And I failed the exam. Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I have just loved the opportunity to be with Malcolm. It literally has just been an education, and it is just so enjoyable to be with a mind that studied so vastly, gained such mastery, and uses the Christian faith to actually help us understand our deeper life with God. One of the ways in which Malcolm has continued to contribute to my life is through his love and interpretation of George Herbert. And so we've asked him to conclude our time by reading Herbert's poem Love, and then reading the poem that he wrote in conversation with Herbert's poem Love. Malcolm?
Thank you. Well, this is, Herbert is, let's see if I got my glasses here. This is when Herbert made the notes on this and sent it to Nicholas Ferrer at Little Gidding, you know, and said, if you think these passages that have passed between me and my Lord might help another Christian soul, then publish them, but if not, just throw them on the fire. Like, luckily, Ferrer, but he put this clearly, deliberately at the end of the temple. It's the final poem. And it's so powerful that he's living in the era of the gentle, courtly love poem and the kind of delicacy of courtesy. His mother was a great hostess, the courtesy of how does a host make their guest feel welcome. There's all of that. He could have called the poem Jesus. It's a dialogue with Jesus, but he calls the poem Love. And that, I think, opens a door for a lot of people. It's kind of funny enough, you two do the same thing, you know, when they sing in the name of love, you know, one more in the name of love. They really mean in the name of Christ, because, you know, God is love. So this is the account of being wooed by God, the perfect host overcoming all the difficulties for us. Love, 3. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I? The unkind, ungrateful? Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So beautiful, that poem. You know, he finishes with the short line of words of one syllable. There's so much genius. Just one little thing I've got to point out. This is so good. So, in the poetic tradition in which George Herbert is working, it's using classical tropes all the time. So the idea of blind Cupid is really all everywhere. It's almost to the point of a cliche. It's just the iconic. Everybody, every poet up to now says love is blind. What does Herbert do? He says, quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance. And he says, no, love is not blind. True love, the agape love, to which is hugely observant. A good host is the first to notice anything that might, And quick-eyed doesn't mean you're quick to see. Love is quick to see it, but also alive, quick. The quick and the dead, quick-eyed love. I mean, that is just genius. Anyway, so I wrote a while back a sequence of poems called After Prayer, which is, obviously in one sense they've been written after I prayed, but thereafter they follow on from George Herbert's poem Prayer. Okay. And it's a sequence of 27 sonnets, so that's how I feel like Herbert. So there's a line in Herbert's poem Prayer where he says, what is prayer? So softness and peace and joy and love and bliss. So I wrote a sonnet for each of those words and what. Okay. So that meant I had to write a poem 2 or 4 or after George Herbert called Love, like no pressure then. So I thought, well, the only way I can do that is to do exactly what Herbert do, to address the love who welcomes me, but to say to myself, like it's like with George Herbert's finally made it to sit down at the communion. It's like I'm with him, It's the kind of So this is how it came across, and we'll perhaps finish with this. Love took George Herbert's hand, and now takes mine. The same quick eyes, the same wry, welcome smile, the same spear-pierced and always healing heart. He turns to me, and taking bread and wine, he spreads a table in the desert, while I hesitate and draw back, stand apart, afraid, as always, of committed love. But I have come too far to turn away. Though joy has vanished, she has led me here. So come, says love. There's nothing left to prove, and nothing that you need to do or say. I am that perfect love that casts out fear. Sit with George Herbert here. Then taste and see and find that all your loves are found in me.
Malcolm, wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much. Thank you, and just love having you on campus, love having you enriching our mission. Thank you.
Join us next time for another compelling conversation with President Gayle D. Beebe.